have two great people here today looking at the transformation of financial services. Allison Lawrence from Citi and Nathan Mayer from Truist. Allison, why don't we start with you? Why don't you introduce yourself and talk about sort of in this current sort of situation, how is Citi prioritizing innovation and what's top of mind for you?
Yeah, sure. So I handle the fintech engagements and also lead the North America innovation team for Citi, specifically within our Treasury and Trade Solutions business, which is the transaction banking side. So you think large corporate banking. A lot of that, obviously, background, maybe you've experienced it with your own personal business or corporates. Very heavy, manually intensive. Not a lot of digital in the back end traditionally, right? There's still quite a lot of hurdles on that front. And so what we're looking at really and tackling a lot of either the fintech engagements, conversations with clients and work with clients is a lot of initiatives on the digitization fronts, both on faster payments, kind of liquidity measures, corporate card initiatives, the corporate card program, along that waterfront, right? And so, I guess if I had to highlight one of the key initiatives, maybe you see a market over the last couple of days on the digital, expansion of our digital banking portal. So it's a very manual process of account opening and then clients being able to onboard onto the portal in an agile way. That stuff has been, the digitization efforts are rolling this out globally. We've expected 50 countries in the variety of languages we have, has taken several years. And maybe it's great timing that now it's coming to fruition during a time like this when it's actually instantaneously leverageable, immediately prevalent to the times of COVID where you're needing to get things done remotely. You can't be sending documents in, via in person, signing things in person. So it's a good initiative to highlight as one of the examples of where we're doing a lot of the digital efforts in the COVID times.
Great. Yeah, I just went through a refinance. So went through a new mortgage process, which was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. So it was definitely.
Who did you use, Citi, or did you go? But seriously, was it a Citi thing? Like, I'm curious on why. Was it a really good experience, or was it? Was actually
it was Chase. And
oh man,
I know. But no, it was actually a very seamless process. The days of scanning W-2s and chip pay stubs and sending in your firstborn and a sample of blood doesn't exist, because the amount of data that exists now for them to process, especially because they get my direct deposit, they see my daily life without me having to send sort of these documents. So but Drew, I think you're back.
Let's hope I'm back. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
We can.
Okay, so I'm on my phone. So sorry about that. I had a message underneath on my screen saying Zoom wants to crash your computer and turn off. So that must have been the problem. So I'm assuming we've got through introductions here. Yeah.
So Allison, introduce yourself. Yep. We were going to get over to Nathan to give us a little idea of what is Truist for the people who don't know about the merger and the new institution, and a little of your background, and then I'm going to.
Thanks for jumping in, Josh. Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Yeah. So, Drew, glad to have you back. Truist is, for those on the phone that are not aware, is the new brand name for the combined company of SunTrust and BB&T. We announced our merger last, I think it was February at this point, so a little bit over a year ago. And SunTrust was historically based in Atlanta and Winston-Salem, historically in Winston-Salem, or BB&T and historically in Winston-Salem. And there was a lot of benefit for the merger about where we played in the footprint perspective, and then balancing each other out about where we had strengths really in some of the urban areas and in our footprint, where they had a really strong strengths in community banks and in their insurance area and our investment bank. So a lot of pieces that we both complemented each other and could build a bigger footprint within the Southeast, while we continue to look at how we expand nationally. And as part of Truist, I lead the innovation strategy for technology. I lead some of our expansion efforts around direct banks, and also have a role with our human capital, academic relationships, how we figure out what's going to be the next gen talent for the company.
That's great. I know we want to talk about talent today too. We talked a lot about that on the call the other day. And I believe with some of the market fluctuations, I think Truist is now the fifth largest commercial
Yep.
bank in the United States. So congratulations on that. Well, it's great to have you both here, and sorry for my snafu earlier. It's great to have everybody out there in Zoom land. Great to see some familiar faces, or at least names out there. So thanks for joining us. And David Kirkpatrick and I, as we always do, we'll do a little wrap up at the end of this session. And David always has something interesting to say. So for both of you, I guess I'd like to start. I know Alice and I came in and you were sharing a little bit about what's kind of going on in the, in COVID and during the COVID time. But maybe let's just start with both of you. And Allison, we'll start with you. Just how have things changed for you fundamentally? And, yes, in your sort of work-life balance in your everyday life, but more in your role. And then we talked about the other day how we kind of want to start to think about, what do you think is going to change permanently, in terms of either the way you manage or how Citi drives innovation or manages innovation. But share with us a little bit about how you're responding now as a company, and then, what may change permanently down the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the communication factor is key. And I see definitely from at least internal Citi, if you look at internal Citi, not maybe what we're doing on innovation efforts at the moment, what we do with our clients too, but a ton of communication top down. The CEO, Mike Harbut, is doing, bi-monthly calls, every few weeks he's doing open sharings where you can input, kind of questions to him and his management team in a very Zoom level format. Tons of interactions with top-down management, new types of work offerings, new type of HR, apps for wellness, right? And so I think they've done a great deal of work to keep people posted, convey mostly through online communication channels, tie you into your radio ecosystem and work colleagues despite that, and give real-time updates on kind of the updates on going back into the office. And I think that is a core concern to a lot of folks who like to get an update on that. But I think I appreciate their conservatism in that way. And then a lot of the constant updates. So I think on that front, it's a lot, it's promoting a lot of the resiliency factor, right? How are you staying and promoting that work life and creating more guardrails and giving a huge proponent to do so to the workforce, right?
Yep.
I think if you think on the external side, I think the innovation team is busier now than before, right?
Yeah.
I think it's staying in constant communication with clients and business teams, but I do see that big push on more to digital initiatives, things that we probably were getting to last year on some of the client portals were simmering for a bit, and now they're going full steam ahead, right? So if anything, I think it gave a very interesting push. We're in contracting now for a client engagement type of capability with a third party, for example, and it really, I think, accelerated a lot of that front. So if anything, it keeps continuing feeding the book of work, and I think it's looking more on future state of even more engagement on a deeply interactive level, right?
And before I jump over to Nathan for the same question here, I know you're adding some responsibilities in terms of North American innovation and as you think about that, are there things in your head about this? I want to run this a little differently with these added responsibilities and driving that specific area of innovation forward. Are you thinking about managing it any differently coming out of COVID and as we move forward? Is it an opportunity for you to not start anew, but maybe to implement some management, either techniques or priorities in regards to how you manage innovation?
Maybe tying in more closely full circle with our sales teams, right? And I think a lot of times you think inbound, looking on a fintech third party flow, a lot of it is core tied to your product and tech teams, right? What they're hearing, what they're broken, let's go build new products. How do you even create more of that closed loop with your sales teams? And so we have a couple sprints now with all the global sales heads, and how can we create more of that feedback loop? Because I think that engagement will be key. They've got the insights from the clients. Let's make sure it gets to us so we can rectify, build, propose new strategic initiatives. And I think that will be definitely a big change on looking at that, right? So we've got all hands on deck on kind of proposing how we will better work together. And then we can start rolling those out in different ways.
That's great. That's the sales teams is something new that we haven't heard in the last several weeks. That's interesting. Nathan, sort of same set of questions. I have a bad habit of asking 2 or 3 questions at once, but talk to us a little bit about what's changed for you today. How are things moving forward? And it's really an interesting time for you as well, because you're coming into a newly merged organization and adding responsibilities as well on the innovation side. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, so for me personally, I have to say that COVID has led to a few challenges. One, I tried to cut my hair the other day, so for people that can't see, if you want to do that, don't. So as kind of being candid and not trying to avoid that side of my head, I'm letting the group know that it's missing half of my hair, so don't do that. But from a work perspective, I think there's been a lot of things that have been challenges. So not only do I have the technology strategy for innovation, how we want to play in that space domestically, I've also got responsibilities for our BAU processes and working with our partners internally around at least a business office perspective about how do we make sure that we continue to drive forward work that needs to be from a merger perspective, right? So what does a combined Truist look like? How do some of those digital entities start to manifest for our clients? And as part of that, since we are have the technology part from a digital perspective as well, we need to figure out how we work with offshore, because a lot of our teammates were in India and other places throughout the globe. And I'm sure everyone on this call is aware of that India shut down is still in a lot of ways shut down, but was very dramatic and quick, and they did it over a couple of days. So much of our work efforts related to how do we hit some CD1 deliverables ultimately were impacted by not having the resources that we need in place. And so what you need to figure out is how do we risk accept these people that are thousands upon thousands of miles away? How do you get equipment to them where to their homes, right? Because they're no longer going into the office, not only on shore and throughout our footprint, which is all over the US. We had to risk accept that, but most people in the States had laptops so they could figure out a way to work. But in India, and if you think about the Philippines and a lot of these other places, that just wasn't the case. So that made us really start to have to rethink about, forget about innovation for a second. Like, how do we make sure that if this happens again, and hopefully this will never happen again, that our workforce is more diversified, not only in the US when we think of our physical footprints, but how is it more diversified globally, so that we've got workforce throughout not probably every time zone, but at least every continental time zone, so we're not nearly as impacted. I think the other aspects that we've realized with everyone working from home is, we, like I'm sure I also can probably relate to, and many banks can relate to, we were really, really, really slow from collaborative tool perspective. So things like Slack, we just got approved, which is really important for engineers and designers and product owners to be able to, whether it's code, whether it's user stories, which you should be using version 1 and things like that, but whatever that conversation that would typically happen in a team room on a whiteboard now needs to happen digitally. And it was just forced, right? Things like Zoom, where let's just say, for sake of argument, this is being recorded, that yes, I am working on my personal laptop, wink, wink. But these things were blocked, right? And now we have to actually have these conversations across our European partners, our domestic partners, different time zones. Is Skype effective? Is WebEx effective? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? But these are things that we had to think about. So in addition to workforce, we're now having to have a conversation about what tools and technology do we need from a teammate perspective to help us accelerate in a future that is probably digitally driven, not just for our clients, but ultimately for our teammates. And I think the last thing that I would point out is a lot of the things that we've had to stand up, whether it's PPP and initiatives that we're helping deliver loans and handle loan volume, we clearly did not have the capabilities off the bat to be able to handle some of the volume that you're coming in, right? So you have to figure out, how do you leverage partners outside of your ecosystem? How do you work with them in a multi-day perspective as opposed to a multi-month or year? And if you think about sourcing at banks, it could take forever. So I think in that way, it was a very good lesson for a lot of our CEO to see how these teams are working and able to develop something in a multi-day period and get it out the door? And does that impact ultimately our risk stance, which is typically conservative about how we work with partners and how we deliver work product?
That's great. I want to get into the ROI of innovation a little bit, but I want to start because I know we have a lot of people that focus on open innovation or at least leverage it. So I want to dig in a little bit on that. And I guess the context of the question as it relates to open innovation for me now would be how, compared to how you were working with startups or doing competitions and challenges and engaging in those sort of open innovation efforts. I'd even put corporate venture capital into that a little bit. What's going to change moving forward as it relates to open innovation, or what's already changing? Are you working more with startups even more now or less? Are you, all of those sort of open innovation tactics and techniques, where's that fitting in now? And where do you see that going as we get to, sort of the other side of COVID? Will there be more reliance on external partners and things like that, or more or less, and why? And I'll let either of you just sort of jump right in here.
So I think so we're at a unique point, right? Obviously, we are just merged, so we are still in the midst of building our collective or our combined innovation story.
Right.
And we had a perspective at SunTrust about where we wanted to play, and I think at BB&T they probably did as well. So we're working through those details specifically as we speak, and it's taken up a lot of my time. I do think that, so my personal perspective, and if I just disconnect from the corporate for a second, I think it's really important to open up the external lens. And I tend to view innovation as an outside-in perspective, meaning that we need to have a foundational capabilities in banking, whether it's open modular architecture that allows us to connect easily with a lot of partners. But we need some of those things in place to be able to define where our strategy is and figure out who in the space that can ultimately help us deliver against that. As much talent as we want to hire at the bank, whether it's engineering, whether it's product, whether it's some of the stuff that our venture teams are starting to do, we still need a broad perspective about what's going on. And I view that from an academic perspective, 10 years out, early stage startup, and some of the people that are in the space are on accelerators. How do you partner with some of the late stage venture companies, whether it's an NEA or Andreessen, people that are out there that you understand what they're working on. You have either partnerships or investments with them. So you at least at a minimum have a baseline perspective about what's going on worldwide in the spaces that you may be interested in. And that could be anything from fintech to your specific business line. And the way I think some of the ways our innovation story is starting to come together is really leaning on that and knowing that we need to partner with those companies and those individuals across the spectrum to really innovate for our clients.
That's great. Same thing, Allison, working with external partners, and where are you?
Yeah.
Where are you going with that?
Well, I thought you made a decent point, Nate, on the, yes, growing ties with those external accelerators and VCs. And I think before all this shut down, it was very easy. It was almost more natural to get an inbound of relevant companies because you'd be out at conferences, you'd be out at showcases, you'd be out at webinars. And there was a constant, relative inflow from leading. Now that that's out, it's been forced to be much more. I've, kind of sat back and said, all right, let's reanalyze who I'm strengthening ties with directly and start coordinating calls on that front. Right.
Sure.
So it's being much more cognizant about setting up some of those inbound, strengthening a lot of connections with VCs who I would speak to occasionally, but now it's making it more of a, a coordinated continual effort. Obviously we have a venture arm called City Ventures, which are super close, partners with the business. And I know banks with VC arms, different bottles of working, but typically, I dual hat within it. So I work very closely with them. So they're also a great pair of eyes in the ecosystem. We have an accelerator in Tel Aviv that it continues, throughout this to do more on webinar. And they've always done it via webinar style because of the broadcast for, say, North America teams. Yep. So I think in that way, they've been relatively uninterrupted if you think about it. But increasing, I think another hurdle we have is one of the core proponents we were doing was running fintech events throughout the last 2 years. They're all highly internal. They're all strategically thus held internally. now that we're not going to have a full day, no one's joining for an 8-hour session on Zoom, right?
Right.
It's making it much more coordinated around strategic business priorities, core team members, and you're tracking that in a variety of deep dive sessions to fruition that way. So,
Right.
you know, I think it's still marching toward, you talk about KPIs when we stand up the program, ultimately number of tests and POC pilots and number of commercial deals signed. You know, we were up 60% on the commercial deals last year or the year before. I think it's just become more focused on, all right, let's really target in, talking to players one-on-one. So if anything, it's more call time, right? As opposed to otherwise. And I think it does create upstream value for sure.
No, that's great. And along those lines, Allison and Nathan, your thoughts as well. And, you know, how will the ROI sort of metric for both of you and broadly, how might that evolve as we sort of come through COVID and then out on the other side? Do you think that it'll be the same types of ROI metrics? It is a little different now because you don't have as much inbound, right? So in that way, maybe the sourcing of potential partners has slowed a bit because you don't get as much sort of proactive inbound when you're out and about in the ecosystems. But how might ROI change, and how would you change if you were measuring yourself on sort of ROI in terms of as you report up the chain and you know, communicating that return on investment?
I mean, I think we try to stay on
either
target.
of you can avoid the question too.
Well, I mean, I think that the underlying KPIs and hopes for success, right, are really getting the partnerships and new products, partnerships out in market, right? I think what will change is kind of the focus for those, right? So now more on digital first customer experiences, right? Because that's becoming paramount. Maybe working more with tools to enable remote workforce. So like you say, I'm on Zoom on my personal phone because we don't quite have it up yet live across the city. And so things like that is really a focus then on shift on enabling maybe different areas than perhaps would have been fast tracked not as much before, right? Yep. And so I think it's still a core focus on creating that value both internally and externally for our clients around a variety of use cases, but probably in more enhanced ways due to the operational circumstances.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, look, I mean, here's the challenge, right? I mean, just being saying the completely obvious elephant in the room. And we're at an unemployment level at this point that is not seen since the Great Depression. There's no one in this panel, which is a quite small panel, certainly not Allison or I, or anyone probably calling in that remembers that time or knows what the implications are going to be. But banks in general are obviously going to be impacted. We're seeing margin compression already because you know, just think about where rates are today, which is typically a big driver from an investment perspective. And, you know, we have a lot of I'm talking about the industry specifically, when you start thinking about the companies that are impacted the most, small business, commercial, where we all probably have a level of exposure that is going to have diminishing returns on the balance sheet, right?
Right.
So I think to Allison's point about how do you, there's always the ROI in some ways is going to be smaller across the board for probably an extended period of time, no matter what you're investing in. So if you look at the next 24 to 36 months, I think there are things that we talked about from a digital perspective specifically that may not have had a comparable ROI to maybe something that was in the credit card portfolio, or some sort of other lending mechanism for a variety of reasons. And now when you start comparing it, you not only know you have to be at par to a lot of these competitors, but it's just not at par with competitors, it's at par with someone that goes to Amazon. We know from a digital perspective, they take their great experience that they had digitally, and they think of that when they interact with a Chase or a Citi mobile app or a Truist mobile app. And you have to point to how that experience is ultimately going to drive revenue down the road, especially with the target segment that you're going after. Truist specifically, we tend to be over leveraged in an age group that is very profitable, but is retiring, and assets are starting to dwindle as they start to tap into those assets. How do we figure out how to attract people that are probably 50 and under, that are going to be those wealth clients, and how do we build experiences that will bring them into house digitally and then allow us to connect with them across a variety of offerings that we have. You're really shifting you're flipping it on its head, where that typically would have happened with one of our advisors or would have happened in a physical location. That may not be the case anymore. So I think banking in many ways had to rethink this to begin with. And we saw all the variety of players that are getting in and taking revenue on the sides from us. Now we're being forced to do it because there are going to be a lot of clients that are going to be reluctant to come in to have that face-to-face conversation. So how do you make sure that that connection is something that is meaningful to the clients in the digital landscape?
That's great. Josh, I can't really text on the side here, so I'm going to verbally communicate. I think Mike Ellison has a question out there, and then we'll go to David from Techonomy after that, and there's a couple other good questions that have rolled in here. So Josh, I'll let you introduce Mike.
Mike, you should be unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, guys. Great comments, and sort of piggybacking off what your comments just were talking about. I'm curious, how has COVID really impacted your digital transformation strategy from the consumer perspective, the platforms, the customer experiences you guys are putting out? I mean, it sounds like you were just remarking on how it might have sort of added fuel to the fire of the importance of it. But what do you see? If you could maybe expand on some of the thoughts you guys were just talking about, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, it's a greater even expansion, global rollouts, right? And I think if usual stage gate a lot of these offerings because it's such a global remit, different regional rollouts and a time frame, if anything, right? Let's get those on target, keep them on the target list as we have for rolling out to ensure that these are available. Once again, citing some of the digital onboarding experiences, getting the account opening process digital was part of it. When COVID hit, it was realizing, all right, the account's open, but they're still entailing a lot of manual work to allow clients to service the accounts, right? That spun up incredibly to augment them to be able to do self-service initiatives off of the digital banking portal within the first couple months, right? And I think huge acceleration on that front, tons of time spent training internally to get those getting up to speed. I think there was a lot of resource devotion, obviously, to that component. I think it's probably working more closely to ensure that we're working with our commercial banking partners on similar solutions, right? And so where we can tie together some of our offerings for commercial banking market, we're leverageable. Let's start extending those partnerships. And I think we've gotten much more up to speed on kind of the client interaction piece with digital banking initiatives. So not just the chat, but how do you make it more real-time and instantaneous, and really working on the data analytics behind it. So it's a work in progress. I think there's a tremendous amount of push behind it. And then it's closing a loop also with the instantaneous kind of sales feedback. And I think that's the other piece we're looking at.
That's great. Josh, I'll let you keep rolling with questions here.
Yeah. Nathan, did you have a comment there or?
Yeah, so I agree with pretty much everything Allison said. I think one of the things that we've been thinking through as part of this is I always lose track of the camera. Like at some points it's like at my chest and off in a different angle. If I'm not paying attention, so apologize. So I think one of the things that's difficult for banks in the digital space is that it's just not the end experience. If you're going, and I'm talking about internally, right? The clients see the end experience and it's either good or bad, and they're going to have a perspective on it. As we talked about before, they're going to take every other digital experience they had on and take that to the table. But for banks, it's also figuring out how do you reconfigure your architecture and your infrastructure and put things in place that allow you to accelerate in the digital space. I mean, if you are a big bank like the both of us are, right? And I can't imagine the complexity that Citi has having to be international and the regs that are in all the different countries that they're in, right? But from just a core technology stack perspective, you've got to have the right modern architecture in place to be able to drive the digital experience that your clients expect. So if you're sitting there with a lot of executives and trying to make the case for why we need to accelerate in the space, you can't then disconnect it from the fact that it needs to be investments in the stack itself, because one can't happen without the other, right? And so that's one of the things that we continue to push from a technology perspective. You've got to modernize from the ground up to be able to get towards the vision that you're trying to create from an experience perspective. as far as deliberate efforts that we put in place, I think we've heard from a lot of clients about, I don't want to go into the branch, or if your branch is opening, is it going to be a Zoom call or something else? So you have to create automated scheduling that allows a client to sit there and say, okay, I've got a 9 a.m. free time on Thursday. Can I come in and meet with my advisor, right?
Right.
These things probably should have always existed. It's kind of crazy that they didn't exist, but in many cases they didn't, right? It was still a very binary conversation, like yes or no with your advisor, whether you can have that interaction in person. Now there's multiple options. So I think even things like that blend both the digital, can I schedule this appointment? What options do I have? With the in-person, are they still going to be there to even meet with me? If I do want to meet with them in mask and hazmat suits and whatever else it may be.
Right.
These are all things that we need to think about if we really want to advance. And then I know that we focus a lot because I think most banks' impact is still on the consumer side, regardless of who you are. But the digitization process, I think, is most ripe for disruption from a bank perspective in the wholesale and commercial side. Because there's been so little work done there for our business clients about how do you take the concepts that they see in their everyday life and help them run their business. I think if anyone starts to figure out that space, they're going to have a very significant leg up, because everyone's focusing on the consumer side, not only banks, but whether it's startups, it's a lot of volume, right? And in so many ways that makes sense.
And just I have a quick follow-up there, and for both of you really quickly, where do your sort of respective groups, your where do you roll up to? Do you roll up to a CTO, a CMO? Who owns sort of, innovation for both of you in regards to what you're doing? And do you think that will continue in terms of the group or the C-suite person that you ultimately roll up into?
So for us, it's, the merger part, it's, we
It's going to make it difficult.
It's
Sit in two places.
Kelly King, who's our CEO today, is retiring in September 2021, and Bill Rogers, who's our CEO, is taking over. So all of innovation rolls up to Bill, and it's an ongoing dialogue with Bill about what we're doing across a variety of things that we're expecting to play in, and he's very heavily invested in it and a significant supporter. And gives us a lot of cover where we need to have cover. But we kind of split it in some ways. So we look at it from a technology and an experience perspective, so that we are driving technology initiatives that are ultimately going to enable the experience across everything from the investment bank to the retail bank.
Great,
thanks.
And Allison, let me get at Allison's thought on that.
Yeah,
Curious where you roll into.
Yeah, so I guess we roll up into the head of global treasury and trade. And so what we did about 10 years ago, we started our first innovation lab for the transaction banking side in Dublin. So right after the financial crisis, right, invested in building that out there. Since then, we've rolled out eco labs in Singapore and then New York. So we're kind of covering as much of the global spoke on that as possible. And we built up those labs, right? So we have product folks in there, data scientists, tech teams, design thinkers, really stack them on there to act as immediate resources for the ecosystem, both for our clients and internal teams. So they're really mandate for the business, right? Because they're a separate function. So if you see it, it's a little bit of a matrix where they're split regionally. And then there's also horizontal teams. And so I think it's very key. It kind of goes back to what Nathan was saying on underlying infrastructure. There's so many themes that go across the business lines. You think all the different servicing pillars we have within treasury and trade, many of those will overlap. And so in order to kind of effectively mitigate those silos, setting up certain horizontals where we see key to our future developments, one of them being blockchain, right? Which can apply to a variety of different back-end use cases.
Yeah, we could have a whole conveation about that, right?
Yeah, and so now we're trying to figure out how to do whiteboarding sessions on blockchain initiatives with clients in a better way. Which I don't know yet how that's going. And then big data AI and e-commerce. And you think about the e-commerce and how that's impacting the different payments and receivables versus what you can do within supply chain trade, which are both two different components of TTS. I think it's yes, supporting up to the business and then making it very keen on setting up areas where we can drive efficiencies across. And a lot of those are rooted in their underlying tech operations and teams.
That's great. We got so many good questions out there. So Josh, let's get to as many as we can.
Yeah, we'll go over to Brian Reed. I think had a question regarding mobile. Brian, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
You can.
Looks like it's working. Thanks, guys. I've enjoyed these many of the weeks. So it was actually interesting as you're talking through the innovation, you talked about more remote work, and Nathan made the comment of how do you move from months to days on the innovation path. I mean, one of the key things we're seeing now is everybody's remote. And, you know, Allison, you rolled out a new, sounds like web digital experience, but what about the mobile experience itself? We're seeing a lot of spikes in innovation on the retail side in terms of trying to work on better mobile apps to capture that user or that B2B customer where they are in the moment in time. And some of our projects are now accelerating because of that demand. I'm kind of curious how you're handling that. While you've got to fix the back end to enable the digital transformation, how are you dealing with mobile apps specifically as part of that ecosystem?
Well, speaking from transaction banking side, if you think the CFOs who are our buying centers for these large corporates aren't usually doing the majority of their operations on their phone, right? Not like you or I would be on a consumer side. So believe it or not, obviously it's not a new portal, it's the same portal, but with much more enhanced self-service, API connectivity. Majority of that is used on desktop, right? Just because of the nature of the user entitlements. We obviously have a mobile app on that, but it is not the majority of used, right? A lot of work on the consumer side and in our retail has been more augmenting a lot of the channels on that way. I think an interesting one that we're working on now and just kind of pilot out live with our team is sales, being able to take on notes with clients on their phone, right? So you're editing notes into CRM, you're outreaching and inputting new deal flow in there. You used to have to go in the desktop, but if you look at sales, they're out on the road, they're on their phone. Why are we putting them in the same way as you would think of it doing our normal corporate treasurers? And so now I created an app on that factor, so entirely internal, but really catering to that digital method where we see for our own and how they can better drive their own success on that front. And so I think that was an interesting one we just went live with last week, basically.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. We'll go to Sam Hass. I think had a question about cloud. Sam, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
I'm glad you chose that one. I was going to ask that too.
Sam, are you there? We'll give him one more second. And if we don't get Sam, let's go over. I know David had a question in the meantime. David, we could go to you while we wait for Sam.
Thank you. What a great conversation. Thank you, all of you. I was sort of thinking big picture about financial services and banking in particular in the context of other industries and innovation. And I was remembering the reason I'm a Citi customer is because Citi was the first bank in New York City to introduce ATMs. This is like around 1980-ish. That got me back then. I've always stayed with Citi ever since. So technology forward, really, way back when. And
it's also David because Truist isn't up there. That's the.
Pardon me? Oh, that's why.
It's also because Truist isn't up there.
Citi was way early on that among the big banks, though. I mean, I think they were the first big bank to do that at a scale. So it's secondly on security. You guys have been way ahead of the curve of industry generally because you had to be, right? Money has to be protected. At the same time now, and particularly in the COVID era, every industry has finally gotten the memo. Everything's going digital. And if you don't get on the case, you're screwed. Okay. And a lot of companies, notably Amazon and Facebook, want to be banks in some fashion. I mean, if you don't think that, I don't think Facebook's got a lot of traction, but their whole Libra thing is definitely a step towards trying to take some of your business in some fashion, right? Meanwhile, anybody knows Amazon has got banking on its agenda. Just today, they launched their first giant game. I mean, they've got every new industry relentlessly on their target list. So when you look at the banking industry, and you don't have to talk about your individual banks if you don't want to in this context, but the banking industry per se, do you think it has the momentum and the capability to stay abreast and ahead given what it's always done? And one last thing that really made me think of this question is the way both of you have hinted around about the things you can't do just got approved on Slack. You know, Zoom is a little bit of an issue. You guys face challenges that other industries don't face that are not helpful. So how do you look at that?
Yeah.
Well, that's a big question.
That's
The future of
I think
banking.
it's
The
about
future of
innings.
banking.
Debate a
What
lot of
inning are
areas
you
there.
at? Yeah.
I guess I'll go on that one, and then so I'm not going to speak to.
I don't think there's any right answer on this one.
There is
so.
no right answer, so I'm not going to
Try.
speak to Truist or anything that we may or may not be doing in that space. I think it's a good question. I think one of the difficulties that this will ramble a bit, and I don't mean to ramble a bit because I do think it's a risk, and I want to make that clear just from the start. I think one of the things you're talking about, some of the restrictions that we have in place, whether it's around Slack or a variety of technologies that we want to bring in, there's a reason that happens, right? Is we are overly regulated industry, and we are always aware of tools that we bring in that is going to have sensitive client data on them. And if those partners cannot provide the detail that we need to be able to make sure that that sensitive client data is secure, we can't partner with them. Because if we did and we were hit from a fine perspective, not only, in many cases, a fine is just going to be, cents on the dollar, quite frankly, from a balance sheet perspective, but it will be all over the press and it will talk about, clients' data being exposed. The benefit to that is that we are still seen from a client perspective as someone that provides trust. So the people that you listed, whether it's Facebook and Libra, and I'm not, my own perspective on that is I don't know why any federal government would allow Libra to control the currency. How do you actually handle monetary policy if you've got a for-profit company doing that? It just seems levels absurd. I mean, there is a digital currency, certainly I think most countries would probably look at, but that's a completely different conversation. But that is a benefit to us, right? The trust. Facebook doesn't have trust. You've seen all the privacy issues. You see the stuff around Amazon. Do people want Amazon to be able to deliver their toilet paper and bank them and credit cards? Maybe they do. And certainly we've seen it in China with the platform perspective of providing everything to clients. But, there may not be the regulatory burden in other countries that we have here. So does Amazon want to pick up that cost associated with being a regulated bank? Once again, a decision they're going to have to make. But your broader question is, we face threats across just everywhere. And because there's a lot of revenue in the space. So whether you just get into payments, whether you just get into lending, unsecured lending like a Cabbage that's based here in Atlanta, or all the companies that are in New York, those are the risks that we face on a day-to-day basis. And how we counter it is really, how do you develop a culture that isn't completely restricted by risk and compliance, understands how to work with that framework and with the regulators, can understand who's in the marketplace, can either partner or acquire with them to be able to drive forward from an innovative perspective. And I think that's the biggest challenge banks have faced because they're so insular in general. How do you be more of a technology company that enables client experiences as opposed to just a brick and mortar bank? And we're trying to figure that out. I'm sure a lot of other people are trying to figure that out. It's an industry-wide question, and there's no good answer.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's obviously not talking on the consumer where you could see that more of that leap immediately, but large global corporates, just as legacy tech is a bank, they're not moving any faster, right? And I think it's so complex to handle their global needs in terms of a payment, liquidity, et cetera factor. Why would you want to do that as an Amazon? I don't see anybody wanting to get in on that one unless you have significant resources built up to handle that. The intense fraud analytics we put around that for detection, KYC authentication, super rigorous pluses we put in place. I think there's a bigger hurdle on that end for sure, just because the nature of involvement. But I think it goes back a lot to what Nathan was saying about it's that reimagining with your risk stakeholders on how open you can be and how open you should be on these partnership levels. And we work on that all the time with our third party management, restructuring this and going through an onboarding revision process and to actively allow faster pilots and testing. So it's not stuck in a stage gate and holding pattern, right? So there's been a ton of internal evangelization on that front, which is absolutely necessary. You know, we're making measures on that one, but I think it definitely has to be enabled in order to just get stuff out the door to test and validate faster.
Yeah,
right?
and I think related to that, and Josh, I know Sam has a question about cloud, so we'll go there next. But this is a bit
Really
of my
interesting, by the way. I'm going to turn it back to you, Drew, but that was great.
Yeah, and David, it's a little bit related to your question, and I'm going to put my old advertising hat on. You know, the one thing is we drive through innovation, and regardless of whether it's happening in a lab, regardless of whether it's happening at corporate, you know, we talk about purely digital banks. We talk about blockchain and currencies. From like, brand is still incredibly important, if not more important than ever, right? So, David, you talked about getting your, you know, because they had the first ATM. I've been with Bank of America since 1977, and that was my first account when I was a kid, and I remember getting the Versatel card in 1982 or whatever. And you know, it's, you know, and I've been with B of A, you know, ever since. I was with Chase simultaneously as well when I first moved to New York, but when B of A came in, I went back. So brand, you know, when you're thinking about your product innovation efforts, have your, you know, your marketing people there, your internal marketing people there, your agency people there, your PR people there. You know, it's really, really important, because this is going to go out and impact your brand. And, you know, I think back to one of Citi's best campaigns, which was created by my friend Brad Jakeman, which was Live Richly. And, you know, it really, really can make a difference in terms of that core brand, which is still why people trust Citibank, and still why people trusted SunTrust so much in the Southeast, and now Truist. So that's just my soapbox moment. So Josh,
let me add one more.
Oh yeah, please,
one
go
more
ahead.
point on that, just because I think I agree with everything you said about brand, and obviously trying to build a new brand in the environment that we're in is really difficult. But the last thing about the banks, to David's question, I think historically banks were late to the game and understanding the talent that you needed to bring in, the investments that you need to do in the space. But if you look at what Citi's spending, and Chase is spending, and Goldman's is spending, what we're spending, these are large companies, right, that have big budgets that they can start to to move in areas that they think are important. And if you look at, and a lot of this is public data, and you've seen people talk about this, but if you look at hiring patterns and who banks are starting to hire, they're realizing that getting the really good engineer is just as important as getting a really good investment banker. And that you need to continue to make those investments in that space, especially around talent and the people that you bring into your culture.
Yeah, and I'd also quickly say a lot of the CMOs, some of the CMOs, the real strategic CMOs in the financial services space, Jonathan Craig at Schwab, for example, taking on all product as well. Runs all product and runs all marketing, and in some cases sales. So I think you're going to start to see that. Josh, sorry for my soapbox.
No worries. And I thought David was going to say that he chose Citi because I just looked back. In 2011, we hosted a session called "Every Company is a Software Company" with Debbie Hopkins from Citi, with the
Citi Ventures.
Yeah, with Citi,
Citi Ventures,
with the head of innovation for FedEx and for Ford, all talking about the role of that software, in-house software development was going to take for these big companies. That was 9 years ago, right? So they were really pushing Boulder up a hill. Imagine where
I said we were slow. I started my comment.
I did say we started the innovation lab 10 years ago.
Right.
So Citi was way ahead of the curve on that, though.
Right? Yeah. So unfortunately, Sam did drop, but I could ask his question. And I think I think it's to the point, Nathan, you were making earlier. His question was, how do you see leveraging leading cloud providers to accelerate digital transformation? So from an infrastructure standpoint, AWS, Azure, are you leveraging these services that are now available that allow you to turn on new platforms very quickly?
Yeah, we are. And it's just not the new platforms, but it's cost, right? You're able to scale cost and development at a level that you can't do on-prem. So we have been very strategic about partners that we want to work with, and deliberate about public versus private, and how do we leverage that utility to be able to drive forward in the spaces that we want to go into. And from just a pure technology perspective, certainly I think in many ways you have to do that if you've got some legacy systems, as you start to put guardrails around that and pull out the information that you need and containerize it. And so we'll continue to explore that, and it will continue to be, I think, a strength in areas.
It's a process. I agree with you on that one. We're not all there, right? And I think you talk about Citi and the security, very, very intense scrutiny, and that served them well for years, you know, and then I think that also, you get the flip side of saying, all right, well, it might take a little bit longer than you'd ideally want, right?
Right.
Is there slow growing acceptance of working with external cloud partners? I mean, just with the
Yes.
regulations and the proprietary, I mean, talk about the toughest nut to crack financial services, I would think, for AWS or Azure, any of these guys. But are we seeing more
I
acceptance?
think it's small steps, and again, that's what Allison's getting at, like testing specific use cases, moving smaller initiatives over there to get people comfortable with it and understand, are they maintaining the information, the level of security that you need. I mean, I don't know. There may be banks out there that have gone fully cloud. They're not cloud native, obviously, but we've explored and taken small steps with a variety of partners in ways that would not put our clients at any risk.
Right.
Yeah, but I think it goes back to the hiring, right? So
Right.
City was building the City mobile app, which came out a year and a half ago to City FinTech, hired guys from AWS and Google, right? And I think that was key. It's like we have all the great banking tech within City, but let's hire the guys where we needed to go in the end state. So it was a great inbound of like the right talent, you know, and I think that needs to continue, right?
Yeah,
and you get both sides of what's possible.
An earlier conference that I started years ago was App Nation, and the great Andres Wolbert Stock was one of my first keynotes. Yes, some inside baseball there, but Josh, I know we gotta go pretty soon, but do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we have time for one more question. Let's quickly go to Gina before we wrap.
Hi, my name's Gina. I'm a behavior designer based in New York, and I wanted to ask you a question about infrastructure when it comes to CRM. You know, and the thought that comes to my head all the time is, how do we make it easier for people to do what they already want to be doing and help them feel successful at that? So internally, what does that look like from a human resources perspective, and how might your service provider needs have changed? Do you have the right people handling the calls or communications? And from an external perspective, what tech and tools need to be leveraged differently to make sure your customers are feeling heard and issues are getting resolved?
Good question.
That's meaty.
Yes, it is.
It goes back to infrastructure. I think, you know, when I talk about the business silos, a lot of these teams for different offerings across City have built their own data pools, their own data lakes, their own like client outreach systems, but it's a single client stuck in the data in the different backend, right? And so how are you actually getting those insights out at the right time, in real time? These clients are calling. And so a lot of it's been about that backend spaghetti and connectivity. First one, you know, not even getting fancy on new tools. That's how do you even integrate that data and weave together a single client story across that, so that then you can integrate the tools that we have. And I think that's a big component before you even go to the sexier aspects of different capabilities, right?
Yeah.
But that's a decent size hurdle on this one.
I agree entirely. I think I wish my banks were like Delta, and when I call in, they know exactly who I am and can handle all of that immediately. When I used to be able to travel, but it's just not the reality, I think, for a lot of banks at this point, because you've got so many different relationships. A client could have a credit card, a deposit account. They could own a business with you from a commercial perspective. And for a lot of reasons, reg-based, a lot of regulatory structure is put in place where you'd have to treat your commercial client different than your consumer client, and you'd have to store that data differently. So how you pull that out to get one 360 view isn't just as easy as saying, let's pull out this information and get one 360 view. You have to understand, are you doing it in a compliant manner? And then from a CRM perspective, I think in anything that you're doing from an innovation perspective, or just BAU, you have to understand where your strengths are and where they're not, right? And where you put investments. Do you just want to build this yourself that becomes unique and it becomes something that a city or a tourist is known for? And that's a huge lift. Or do you want to leverage someone like a cloud partner with a Salesforce to offshore? It's not offshore, but you know what I mean? Be able to externalize that work because they just do it really well. And I think that's more of a philosophical question in many ways that is driven by cost. And I think it's an area that banks have a lot of ground for improvement.
Yeah. Say, Allison and Nathan, thanks so much. We're a little over time. I want to let you go. We could go another hour. We got a lot of great questions out there, but the conversation was just fantastic. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.